Okay, we'll get started. Thank you for joining Political Research Associates today for a roundtable discussion on austerity, which we've titled Austerity Kills. Political Research Associates is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist, multiracial democracy. Today, we are diving into political economy with a discussion on austerity politics, how austerity has led the US to this moment of profound wealth inequality and inadequate welfare provisions for the millions of Americans facing underemployment during the growing recession. For this discussion, we are joined by Saka Bhatti, Co-Executive Director of ACRE, Action Center on Race and the Economy, Donald Cohen, Executive Director of In the Public Interest, Daniel Hosang, Associate Professor of Ethnicity, Race and Migration and American Studies at Yale University, and Lauren Jacobs, Executive Director of the Partnership for Working Families. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start us off with a question on where we see austerity playing out in our current moment. Within weeks of Joe Biden announcing a $3.5 trillion economic plan, the head of his transition team, former Senator Ted Kaufman, told the Wall Street Journal, "When you see what Trump's done to the deficit, forget about COVID-19. All the deficits that he built with the incredible tax cuts were going to be limited." Kaufman's statement echoing what PRA founder Gene Hardesty described in 2014 as the constant drumbeat of the message of scarcity and debt that helps neoliberals justify budgetary restrictions on government spending. I'd like to start us off with a discussion on whether and how we see an austerity approach playing out in the post-COVID recovery period and under a new presidential term, be it a second term under President Trump or Biden presidency.
Thanks. I think I'll jump in before turning it over to Lauren, Sakib, and Donald. And I mean, so thanks to PRA for bringing us together. I mean, I think this is absolutely the question that every organization across every sector is going to confront after the election, and indeed, regardless of the outcome of the election. And I'll just add, maybe quickly by way of context, there's a particular kind of scale of the austerity politics that are awaiting us at all levels, at the federal government, state, local government, school boards, water districts, you name it. But this is, of course, the accumulation of a long, long project across many, many decades. Not just to limit through taxation and other revenue means the access that we have to the kind of goods we need, but also a really deep investment in a set of ideas about that government should run akin to a business, that we are collectively as citizens something akin to a consumer, the whole logics we use to understand this. And just the other two things to add is, this is of course a bipartisan project. At different points, both parties have absolutely advanced these politics. And I think the one thing that we really have to think about now and will struggle with is why austerity politics appeal to a surprisingly broad range of people. Because on the one hand, it's repressive. It's about denying services, again, the things we need. But on the other hand, it's often sold or appealed to people as something that frees them from something, frees them from the interference of the state and government, et cetera, and can actually appeal to a broad range in communities of color and working class communities as well. So I think there's work to do there to figure out how it is that austerity politics take hold in this way. But I'd love to hear, Lauren, Sakib, and Donald, how are you seeing austerity play out in your respective work? Like, what is it looking like now?
So I'll follow Daniel's order. I think I agree with all the framing that Daniel did about what we're facing. I also want to sort of point us towards the hope part of this, or trying to be an optimist in this. We know this is coming. We're going to be fighting austerity. But unlike past fights where we've been a little bit caught off guard because there have been shocks in the economy that some of us maybe saw coming but didn't want to believe, or didn't see coming and were caught off guard by, depending on where we are, we know this is coming. And in the midst of a crisis, there also can be opportunities for progressive forces, for forces that are really believe in real shared prosperity and real equity, to be able to turn the tide and make shifts and make new things possible. So I do think it's both like we are going to have these fights, certainly in post-COVID, we may have had this had there not been a pandemic, given there were predictions that there was another cratering that was going to happen in sort of the fall of overinflated values of housing and other goods in the market. But in knowing this is coming, how do we want to position ourselves, and how do we want to talk about and sort of upend the common sense and the logic of austerity, which we should really start to talk about is frankly a lie. It's not that there's a lack of resources, it's about who controls them.
Yeah, I think just building off of that, the other thing that's just very clear in this moment is when we're seeing yet again, for the second time in 12 years, there's endless money to bail out corporations, to bail out banks, to just throw money at the private sector. The same corporations that in many cases are actually doing quite well, right? Like if you look at the fact the Federal Reserve is buying corporate bonds of like Apple and other sort of like Verizon corporations that are actually having a great year because everyone's suddenly doing everything over, on the computer and over telecom stuff. And so, but yeah, so it is this thing of like even the logic of austerity only applies when it comes to talking about our communities. It doesn't apply when it comes to talking about corporations. And I think that contrast and something that like I feel like having been doing this work back in 2008 when we had major Wall Street bailouts, that this time I feel like people are sort of very quickly up on this and up in arms over this and really organizing around it. So I think there's an opportunity here to really turn this on its head to be like, actually, we can't have constantly austerity for the masses and like, welfare for the wealthiest corporations. And yeah, that I think what's great about this what's great about this opportunity here is that we can actually like, if we organize and do our job, we can actually really make the case for taxing the corporations, the billionaires that actually have been profiting off the crisis all along, and flipping the austerity on its head. Of course, it's not going to happen on its own, and there's a lot of work cut out to do it, but I think the opportunity is there and clearer than it's been in a long time.
So I had a couple things and agree with everybody who said. So the way I think about austerity is not so much in what's going to happen next and what happened in 2008, but this, as Daniel was saying, this is a political project that started quite some time ago. And if you think about it, there's a few things. So Reagan cut taxes and increased military spending, right? So that's part of the reason he did that is because they want to reduce the size of government. They want to reduce people's commitment to government services, because if you cut spending on, domestic spending, services do get crappier, and people get more say, well, that's, government must be wasting my money. Sort of to your question, Dan, is why do people, why is it appealing? I think it's appealing because one is at a natural level, we think we should live within our means. That's sort of just a human thing, even though it doesn't relate at that level, but it's human. And secondarily, they think government wastes money. So, they must have it. So, so I think that it's really about a project that goes much deeper, as we all know. To the extent that, we talk about austerity as simply, there's too much debt, so therefore we have to cut spending. That's just a piece of the puzzle, right? Because, Clinton did raise taxes, and had a surplus by the end, so that was good. But our schools have been suffering for a long time. Our water systems haven't been paid for. We just haven't we haven't been bringing enough money to pay, to provide services and build infrastructure and kind of create a good society for quite some time. The other thing I would say in terms of this current moment is that, well, this is all true. We are going to be faced with, school districts, cities, counties, and states, because of how they budget, are going to be faced with real crises, and not so simple to just go get the money. So that's part of our reality. They've got to either go to the ballot and folks say no, or they can't go to the ballot or what have you, because of how state and local budgeting happens. So we're going to have to figure out how to advance these ideas in places with friends who are on those, represent those jurisdictions and are leaders in those jurisdictions, who actually have pretty limited tools.
Thank you all. I appreciate you sort of setting the context, and Lauren and Saqib for setting the stage, and for us to think about what are we going to do to address the current moment, and what we're going to talk about through the course of this webinar. I'm going to shift a little bit to talking about rhetoric. Over the past few decades, accelerated especially under President Trump's administration, we've seen a significant shift in the Republican Party's public rhetoric, from calls for neoliberal conservatism directed at middle class and affluent voters to misogynist and white supremacist signaling to the party's populist base. How has the heightened wealth inequality stemming from the continued erosion of public programs, coupled with tax cuts and bailouts for corporations and their CEOs, contributed to the evolution in the strategy of the right and the rhetoric that most resonates with its voters?
I guess I'll just take that up, and maybe as just a quick chance to talk about some work that we've done that's been really in conversation with a deep legacy of scholarship that's been connected to PRA around the kind of cultural frameworks, the symbols, the figures that all of us use to make sense of something that's quite abstract, the economy. And this comes from work by Matt Lyons and Chip Berlet, that these really two kind of recurring figures, as we have a kind of a shared common sense about this idea of the producer, this kind of independent, sovereign, usually marked as masculine and white figure who earns what they get. In contemporary thing, we think of this as the taxpayer, the hard worker, the silent majority on the one hand, and the figure of the parasite, the person that lacks work ethic, refuses hard work, doesn't pay taxes, takes rather than gives on the other. And these figures go back to the start of the founding of the country and the mythology, and mythology is really important here to think about the kind of white, independent, small farmer who works and earns his keep and then has to trust, but also be wary of the government for taking too much of what he earns. And I want to just really emphasize mythology here because, of course, there's no figures that are independent or sovereign in that sense. Their wealth is earned by exploiting others. It's earned through enslavement. It's earned through land theft, et cetera. But it helps to kind of legitimate the continued and ongoing inequality that is always goes hand in hand with this idea of like a liberal democracy. On the other hand, this figure of the parasite, the taker, actually moves around at different points. So it's sometimes in the early 20th century, it's the immigrant from Europe. On the West Coast, it's the Chinese and Mexican immigrants. It's almost always the figure of blackness and kind of the very legitimation of slavery as necessary to discipline people who refuse these kind of virtues. So anti-blackness undergirds all of it. In the 20th century, we just see this coming up in figures like the allegations over the welfare queen and the immigrant who's taking services rather than giving. So it's a recurrent way that culturally people understand these divisions. And just the last thing I'll say about this is more recently, people remember in 2012 when Mitt Romney was running, he had this comment that there's the makers and the takers, which is another articulation of it. And he said the makers are like 47% of the population, the takers are 53. Neoliberal inequality has grown so dramatic, and the taking, the evisceration of the service net and the wealth, that now even many white, middle and working class folks are also finding themselves accused of being parasites. So if we think about the ways that teachers and public employees have been attacked across really the last 20 years, largely, though certainly not exclusively, but largely white workforces, teachers, especially in red states, they're accused of these very gendered and racialized, historically racialized terms of being lazy, unwilling to work, taking, greedy, et cetera, people that need to face discipline. So this is not an argument that they are somehow in the kind of racial landscape that there's a convergence, but it is the notion that the very narratives and accusations that have long been used to criticize and exclude a large number of people of color have now been brought to bear in some ways on white workers and white communities as well. Again, it doesn't mean their positions are converging, but it does mean that, what women of color have long talked about, which is that this is coming for you as well. So I think the need then to think about how, just the very last thing I'll say is, claims now to say, you know, well, I'm a producer and therefore I deserve it, are going to be difficult to sustain because one, we're all dependent on one another. And second, if we just declare, I'm a producer, I put in the work, I deserve some of this, we're absolutely setting up the grounds for other people to be denied that claim because allegedly they haven't done that work. So getting out of this producer parasite framework, which many of us fall into, many labor unions in their contract negotiations say, look, we deserve a piece of this because we're doing the work. But I just want to, you know, part of the caution here is that when we participate in that framework, we can inadvertently legitimate the abandonment and dispossession of others who can't make that claim. And we tend to lack language to think about deservedness that's not tied to those categories of, you know, what I've earned to require this.
Thank you, Daniel. Would anybody like to respond?
I was building on that.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Chucky. No, you go ahead.
I was just building on that. I mean, I think it's interesting, this notion of like, you know, makers and takers in place. That we do a lot of work in our organization looking at municipal budgets and looking at public debt. And right, so in particular, in the past, I've done a lot of work looking at the Puerto Rican debt crisis and like the bankruptcy in Detroit, as well as sort of budget crises in Chicago. And there is this common thread that you have where in Michigan, the narrative is that Detroit sort of sucked up all the resources from the rest of the state, right? And it's very racialized. Detroit is a 90% Black city. And the Black Detroit sucks up the resources from the rest of the state. And that's why we have to clamp down, discipline Detroit. And in reality, Detroit, when it comes to like state revenue sharing, was a net donor. It actually gave more city than ever. It gave more money to the state than ever got back. In Chicago, where I'm from, similarly, there's this theory that folks downstate have that like, oh, if Chicago weren't here, we'd have a lot more resources. Like, if Chicago weren't here, you'd have nothing actually. Like, most of your money comes from Chicago. It comes from the very cities that you like to villainize. But the logic of austerity is such that it sort of very much relies on, as Daniel was saying, white supremacy, because you're able to basically, through the logic of austerity, reinforce white supremacist tropes and use those tropes to then in turn sort of call for more austerity, right? So for instance, in Chicago and Detroit, you had the state put an emergency manager in place that basically took away all local democracy from the folks in Detroit, and basically could rule by decree in the interest of the creditors to the city, right? And the state of Michigan at the time of the bankruptcy, I know, had put emergency managers in place in I think about a half a dozen cities. All but one of them were majority Black cities. The majority white city where they had put an emergency manager in place had requested that one be put in place for them. And there were cities in Michigan that had worse finances than those majority Black cities, but they didn't get emergency managers because they were seen as responsible and they can manage their finances. And so, yeah, I think very much like the logic of austerity both like undergirds and reinforces white supremacy.
All right, you want to go next?
I'll follow you, Daniel, because I know you were trying to hop in.
No, just because it was, I mean, it connects to all. Cause we all, by the way, we all know each other really well, all the people on this call. So we've been working together for years, if that's not clear. Because I wanted to follow up with Daniel. So so I totally agree, this maker and taker. I mean, if you look at Ayn Rand's stuff, it starts there, right? There are the people who are responsible, and there's the people who are moochers, who take off others. And so that's a consistent theme. One of what I think is really important, again, sort of since Reagan, but you could trace it back. So I mean, since Reagan is to this idea of, because we want people to pay higher taxes. I mean, not just the wealthy, but we want people to support government. We want people to pay taxes. We're not weighing into that. But the theme about welfare queens is the government serves someone, the other. And of course the undeserving other, of course the Black other, of course, in the 90s it became the brown other, 80s and 90s, and now even, most recently it's the, public sector union members or workers, they're the others. So I think that theme of it serves others is sort of, is quite resonant with people, because if you don't experience something, you think it's somebody else is benefiting and I don't benefit. And I think that's pretty important because we don't, like, what do you think about when you think about the government? Like, oh, great, they're picking up my trash today. It's not like we think about it every day, our connection, or we turn on our water faucet. The other kind of irony there, this is not about white supremacy, but it's in the notion of other. And I think Trump used some of our work well. Wall Street, right? The swamp. Government serves somebody else. So if people think government serves somebody else, there's clearly a racial piece of that, without doubt, deep, deep, deep. But it's also things that we would say, actually, government is in fact serving someone else right now. So, but we should be thinking thematically how we move forward on that without continuing the disconnect, furthering what fundamentally is at its core racist. The other thing that I'll just say that kind of weaves in here is the sort of common, our natural beliefs in personal responsibility, right? There's personal responsibility, there's collective responsibility. And I think, people think, people raise their kids with personal responsibility. So that's another thing. Those Black people, those poor people must be doing something wrong. That speaks to to human nature. And I think that it's important to understand that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to, I so much agree with so much that's been shared by all three of my sort of co-panelists here. And I wanted to lift up another point about just maybe what does this point to that we should be doing? Because I'm not sure that I have much more to add in on the analysis part, other than actually I would say that I think one way to think about how this works is that it is a dialogue. It is that you have sort of neoliberal policies that need to move, and it feeds off of white supremacy. We have white supremacist thinking that then feeds more neoliberal policies. I think you can think about, for instance, the desegregation of schools and how those were some of the first campaigns that neoliberals cut their teeth on in the United States in terms of getting a taste of actually having some power to enact policies, and sort of the move to move more white parents, to have white parents flee public schools into private schools, which then, given how we pay and fund public schools, depletes the funds going into schools. And then we sort of have a perfect argument and say, oh, the public school system's failing overall. It's a failed project, right? So we could see that as how that's played out as well. We've seen sort of the dialogue around for anti-welfare, sort of campaigns in terms of messaging being about those people who are on welfare, even though we know numerically and percentage-wise, the majority of folks receiving public assistance are actually white within the United States. But then you could even convince people who themselves are receiving public assistance to fight and mobilize against it to prevent those people from having it. So I do think we have to see that this is not just sort of chicken or egg, and that's what I want to get to and what to do. I do think there's a real sort of taking the task on the left amongst progressives about not falling into this trap of, is it class or is it race? Is it this or is it that? And really understanding that these are interconnected systems. You can't pull them apart, and it is both. And so if we purely fight austerity on the basis of, this is about workers, or this is about just every poor community, and we don't name that this is also about combating how white supremacy is deployed, right, by forces sometimes occupying elected office, sometimes campaigning from outside, then we will not be effective in actually winning or advancing ourselves. And so just really thinking about that, our strategies have to really be able to speak to both and speak to the ways in which, yes, white workers are being used, right, in many ways, and are being convinced to act against their own family's self-interest through sort of the payout of continuing to be white.
Thank you, Lauren. That was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to getting into sort of what do we do, what are we doing. Before we do that, I want us to talk about privatization before we get into sort of the movement work that you all are doing. As millions more Americans have entered a state of precarity during this global pandemic and deepening recession, gross inadequacies of public provision in the US have been thrown into high relief. Donald, how has privatization contributed to the conditions we're facing today? And what, if any, privatized services have been profiting or flourishing since March or April of this year?
Sure. So let me start by saying how we define privatization. So we define privatization as private control over public goods, which it comes in a few ways. It comes in outsourcing or selling off bridges and roads and water systems and all that, but it also comes from austerity, right? And the way it comes from austerity is that we don't have the money. So what should be a collective public responsibility becomes a private responsibility, right? So that, because we don't have the money and we need the stuff. We need to eat, we need water, we need all that stuff. So, I mean, it also includes sort of deregulation, because if the government agency doesn't have inspectors, environmental inspectors or food inspectors or workplace inspectors, then what happens is the companies either inspect themselves, which they claim they can do just fine, or they don't get inspected. And so what's happening there is the public goods impacted are health, safety, air, ability to breathe, and climate. So that's why we have a pretty broad view. So that's number one. So how it affects in every way. Number two, in terms of the particulars of the pandemic, this current situation is several things are true. Because it is true, cities and states and school boards are desperate. Huge corporations and investors and sort of the capital, the ruling, those with the cash, actually two kinds, investors and corporations that can provide the services, are really looking at this as an opportunity. And they're saying so in some of their investor calls. For example, online charter schools, which in themselves are just a flawed model virtually completely, except for maybe 2 or 3%, are really seeing opportunity, and they are seeing growth. Lauren, where Lauren lives in Pennsylvania, we were just on the phone with Teachers Union yesterday, and there's an absolute bleed from the school district to online charters, because everyone's online, and the onlines know how to do it better now, because that's what they've been doing. So that's number one. We see water companies, global water companies, looking at places where they can basically go to a city and say, you're in deep trouble, give it to us. We'll take care of it. No new taxes, blah, blah, blah. And no new taxes, number one. Number two is a headache off your desk. Number three, and never really articulated, spoken out loud, fewer lives in your pension, fewer people covered by your pension. They're really worried about that. So we see that in multiple sectors. I mean, certainly the private prison sector, education sector, sort of everything we work in. It's been, the long-term impact we don't know, because this is just, we're all in very uncharted territories and who's getting contracts and who's going to get contracts. But there is no doubt, and that's what we're trying to do in each of these sectors, kind of look ahead a little bit and see if we can come up with preemptive work. And let me say one other thing that's really important around this. They say, we'll take it off your hands and don't worry, you won't have to pay for it. We'll save you money. We'll save you money because we're more efficient. More efficient means we're going to spend less money on something, and we all know what that means. Wages, working conditions, service. They also say, well, don't worry about it. There's no new taxes if it's a water system, but the bottom line is there's only one source of that money, and it's us. They'll raise rates. And so there's sort of a free market, love affair that sort of surrounds this sort of discussion that's very prevalent right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Donald. Would anyone else like to jump in on privatization before we move on? So in the conversation, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the specific context in which you all are doing your work. Lauren, I'm going to start with you. Partnership for Working Families advocates for change at the local municipal level. Can you explain the role that cities play in implementing and resisting austerity measures, and why you view local communities as a salient level of analysis and organizing?
Sure. And we principally do a lot of work at the local, at sort of municipal and county levels, but I also don't want to exclude some of our affiliates that are also doing work at the state level. cities is also this often comes this role, and we're in the midst of a moment of crisis in which cities and states are facing massive shortfalls. And I'd say shortfalls because it's like what's in the coffers right now, but it does not take into effect, and I'm sure Saka will touch on some of this as Acre's been doing a lot of thinking. We've been working in tandem with them about thinking about other financing sources, but I want to also talk about things that we should know. So first off, we start with the point of view that austerity is a lie, and I think we have to sort of get our heads wrapped around this, that this is an invented, it is a crisis that is invented to animate and move things and to snatch power. That is typically how it's been used, and mobilize in a bipartisan way, sort of the unifying force being converted almost religious neoliberals. I don't mean religious literally, but like people that are strong believers in neoliberalism. So if we embrace that this is a lie, and we understand that what we are dealing with is a question about decisions that were made either prior to the sort of crisis or whatever precipitated the shortfalls in the coffers, right? Decisions that were made to reduce the amount of income or to give away income. So in cities, we see this through ways in which property taxes are assessed. In the city in which I live, you could be a developer that develops a multi-million-dollar condominium or apartment complex. You will have a 10-year tax abatement to your property, right? Meanwhile, working class residents that have owned their homes for many years are paying full freight on their property taxes. So that's one way in which we sort of see this. And I would say Philadelphia is not unique in this. This has been a major source of fights that have taken on like sort of progressive leadership of unions and others in the city here. But we see tax subsidies that are given out. We see in terms of states, carried interest loopholes that financial industry makes use of that deprive cities and states of enormous amounts of money. So it's understanding like the lack of resources is invented. There are resources where there is business being done. I mean, we know that we're sitting in the middle of, while so many people are unemployed and there is a crisis of folks being able to pay rent, make their payments through their health insurance, put food on the table, that we are seeing the growth of COVID billionaires and trillionaires. So again, so we have to sort of rip from our minds that like we don't have a lack of resources. It's a lack of power by progressive forces and working people to demand that the wealthy and the powerful pay into the shared services. The reason why we think local fights are also really salient and important in this, and we believe this has to be fought on multiple levels, Donald touched on this, this is where it touches people most. So if cities cut sanitation services, you feel that immediately, right? You see that immediately. If your water rates are going up, that is touching you in real ways. Schools are closing, that is real even for people without kids, right? You can see how a neighborhood changes in its dynamics by like how kids are coming and going and what time they're out on the street playing or not, by either having to be transported further. Those are real lived impacts that people can see this. So it's the right place to think about organizing and moving mass movement against austerity and making demands that we get serious about pulling in the revenue and resources from the wealthy and powerful in our regions into making our communities vibrant and livable. The other side of this is really, I think, one of the moments and opportunities we have is a real massive public examination of even when in the so-called stable times, but certainly in times where right-wing forces are going to be pushing for cuts, is looking at how those funds are being spent. So are we spending them on police departments that, if we really just look at the data, have really done nothing to reduce issues of crime or safety or other issues? I mean, I would say don't get murdered because the police will never solve your crime. Like if you just look at the data, it's not working. So it opens us up to really talk about questions about how are we getting at root causes around housing, mental health, drug addiction counseling, other things that will help actually stabilize and support communities to be safe, to be caring, and to be places that are vibrant and joyful, right? And so how are we thinking about this not only as a moment of like, oh my God, a crisis is coming, but a moment to actually see that we can create a riff and advance a different common sense amongst our base and amongst the public at large.
Can I just add one little point to that, just to sort of put an emphasis on it? Fundamentally, the federal government doesn't provide public services. They don't. They're mostly a bank where money flows to the state and local governments to provide all of the services that we talk about, everything. I mean, maybe the exception being the social insurance policies like Medicare and Social Security, which are direct from the feds. But that's where we get our stuff. That's where we connect. That's where everything comes to us.
Thank you, Lauren and Donald. Moving to a slightly different conversation, Sakab, I'd like to talk to you about ACRE's work to dismantle structural racism positioned in opposition to Wall Street and the financial elite. Can you talk a little bit about how private finance underpins the institutions of white supremacy that loom large in public consciousness right now, inequitable access to healthcare, policing, incarceration, and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the defining features of our economy is what we call financialization, right, which is the fact that the financial sector, banks, private equity firms, hedge funds, asset managers, just control a larger and larger share of the economy, of our democracy, and sort of everything that happens in our society, right? So this means that not only are they the largest investors and financiers of, fossil fuel like infrastructure and projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline that pollute the water in indigenous communities, or like major, like coal power plants are located conveniently in Black and brown neighborhoods where they keep the lungs of like white folks clean, right? And so it's not just that they're the major financiers of everything. There's also the fact that their business model is sort of pervasive, right? And one of the core tenets of financialization, the business model in financialization is the idea of shareholder supremacy. You have to return shareholder profit no matter what, and you have to return more profit this year than you had last year. So it's not enough that you're profitable, but you must be more profitable because that's growth. But you can't be endlessly more profitable, right? Like it doesn't actually work. And so what ends up happening is you need to find some place to extract wealth from. And because we live in a society that's very much sort of rooted in white supremacy at its core, it's without fail, the communities that are most targeted for the extraction are Black communities, indigenous communities, Latinx communities, and other communities of color, right? It's one of those things where, and so that is why we have, the fact that we have a private prison industry in itself is just disgusting, right? It's something that most people in other countries can't even understand that this thing exists. But the reason that it keeps existing is because they actually, in order to exist, they need money. They need to have investments and they need to have financing to actually build their facilities, which they get from Wall Street, right? They get that from major banks on Wall Street. In order to, one of the things we've been looking at right now is ACRE put out a report called Police Brutality Bonds, which looks at the ways in which cities actually pay settlements when there are cases of police killings, police brutality against Black and brown folks. And in many cases, the cities end up having to borrow money in order to pay off the settlements, which means that there is $1 of interest and fees, $1 of profit for investors and banks for every dollar the families receive, right? And so the city of Chicago has paid out since 2010 about they've borrowed about $700 million to pay out legal settlements, and they'll pay $1 billion in interest and fees on that $700 million. And that's all profit that's going to investors, to banks, and so forth. With healthcare, as you mentioned, one of the key things we've seen is the fact that there is a clear division in the drugs that Black folks rely on in particular cost more. And we see sort of clear instances of hedge funds buying up pharmaceutical drug companies or making major investments in them, and then they raise the prices. And where do they raise the prices? They raise the prices on drugs that Black people use the most, right? And so there just is this thing that like the finance sector, under the financialization system, we need to have some place to get that extra money. And because our system in this country is really built on white supremacy. That stuff always comes from, without fail, from communities of color and Black folks in particular. And Wall Street is sort of the instrument that allows a lot of that to happen.
Thank you, Saqib. Really interesting to hear you talk through that. Your Acres work is absolutely fascinating to me. Donald, speaking of great work, In the Public Interest does excellent work on monitoring, parsing, and problematizing privatization in education. You talked a little bit about the privatization of online education under COVID, but I'm wondering if you could give us a bird's eye view of trends and repercussions in privatized K through 12 education more broadly.
Sure, there's pieces to that. So going back to the desegregation academies that Lauren spoke to, which I don't think was actually neoliberalism, but I think that was just pure up racism and conservatism. We can talk about that later. The Milton Friedman wanted to, his key idea in the 50s was to do vouchers, which, basically, everybody gets their check and, which to him wasn't even the final solution. It was a step towards basically making it not a public good and making people just go on the market to get education. Vouchers didn't work, right? So, they lost all kinds of political battles in California, where I am. They put it on the ballot once or twice and lost. And so, because of the separation of church and state was some of the bigger issues. So the movement shifted to the growth of charter schools. Now, charter schools in concept, in part, one of the early leaders of the American Federation of Teachers was one of the core proponents of charter schools as laboratories of innovation to, figure out new stuff that would then be shared with the rest of the system to actually improve the system. But what happened is sort of the right wing took it over and said, no, we can turn this into something else. So we have a little micro and a macro problem on charter schools. There's some good charters and some bad charters, but there's good public schools and bad public schools. But the growth of charters is clearly the privatization of our public education system, no doubt. And it's coming from several places. It's coming from some people who, they're frustrated with in Black and brown communities, frustrated with their public schools, and get together and create a school. It's also coming from, big money, who see an opportunity to make profit and that's not just online and brick and mortar. It's also coming from political forces that see the NEA more than the NAFT, but more the NEA, organized teachers, as a key obstacle to reducing the size of government in general and a political opponent in elections. And then it's coming from the ideologues who really believe in the market. Okay, so that choice is really the way to do things. The problem with choice, of course, is that there's winners and losers. It's competition, is that there's winners and losers. All right, and you can't have winners and losers. But that sort of that constellation of forces with enormous sums of money being spent in California, what's the Netflix guy's name? Reed Hastings has spent millions of dollars to advance charters. So has Walmart, the Walton Foundation. And there's a bunch of billionaires that are moving this. With all of those, they're billionaires, so they think they know how to run the world in their market. They think competition is the way to do it, but they also hate us, and they want to, break our union. They don't want workers to be represented. So the growth, I can't think of the numbers off the top, but the growth is dramatic in a bunch of places, and has been over the years. And what you see, what it gets to is on public education is the division of the American public, because some people I know have friends, I'm sure you all do, that send kids charter schools, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's about their kids, but it puts us against each other. It creates a model of competition rather than investment into schools. And so as kids, we've done some research, as kids move from public to charter schools, they take not just the money with them that they get from the state, but they have an even deeper fiscal impact that actually bleeds the public school system. So you get this cycle of the schools don't have the resources, back to austerity. Charters, choice, it's an American as apple pie, further weakening defunding the public school system. The contradiction by the right wingers is they think, I can't think of any conceived reform where giving schools less money helps them. but that's fundamentally what they're saying. So I think it's, and last thing I'll say is public education really is it's key to solving racism. It's key to the economy. It's key to culture. It's key to history. It's key to society and democracy in very deep ways. And the weakening of this system it's not just about the jobs. It's just not about the classroom. It's all about all these things. And now, last thing, in COVID, there's just ed tech companies, and I mean, there's a feeding frenzy of how to figure out how to make money off this stuff. There's, almost $750 billion spent in education each year. That's all.
Daniel, did you want to?
Yeah, I guess I want to, maybe pick up on a couple of things that everyone has said. And I was on a call, Donald, we were on a call last week, and Donald, was in this group challenging us, like, we also have to think about the hard things, the things that we don't quite have figured out yet. And I think it's always an important reminder. And so, just in relation to this, all of the work that abolitionists have tried to do around prisons, for many years, people have pointed to the fact that they have no impact on crime. There's no direct relationship. They spend far too much. The money's much better spent in many other areas of life. And yet, in places like California and many others, that huge constellation, that monstrous constellation of prisons came through ballot measures. People heard that argument and re-upped their investment. That absolutely white majority electorates, but not only white voters were brought into that. The same thing with a long history of discourse around immigration and trying to make the case about the net benefits that immigrant workers pay in versus get out. So I think that this question about how we make legible these questions about who benefits and who loses is a challenge. And then just the second part is as just to build off of Donald's points, that the charter school movement in California in particular, and many other places, was funded by a lot of like hedge fund Democrats. The grassroots forces of that were parents of color and other education leaders who, as Donald said, were long frustrated with the deep forms of segregation and inadequacy. But their racial politics on the right and neoliberals' racial politics are actually flexible. And they're increasingly, if you look at figures like Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, there's a growing bench of Latino Republicans in California and the Southwest that are going to attach those figures to all the projects we're talking about. So I think our capacity to be able to not just name it that it's, because what happens is we name it as racist, and they say, well, look at all these people of color who want charter schools. And it seems like that undermines the kind of criticism. So I just want to name that as like, I actually think that the racial politics of the right, it's not that the politics are growing any more moderate or any less committed to market and authoritarian solutions, but they have figured out how to, like every corporation and every other thing, put a kind of multicultural kind of front on it. And I think we kind of haven't quite figured out how to both center a critique of white supremacy and racism on the one hand, and take seriously that this is not just the John Birch Society of 50 years ago that would never have done that. So they move too, and I don't mean to say they move in some sense of committed to equity, but they move in terms of thinking about who can be incorporated into their projects.
Is it okay to jump in on one point?
Yeah,
Jenny, I totally agree. I also think it's how are we deepening our understanding that people of color, Black people, Latinx folks can be mobilized by racist tropes as well, right? And it's sort of one of the things we don't like to speak about, but every much like the sort of sense of like what makes a good school and the presence of white kids making the school good. Our communities are just as susceptible to that thinking as other parents, right? I do also think in terms of, maybe moving off of schools and to your other point about how do we, lift up alternatives or change sort of the framing of how we even start to discuss these problems. I think one question becomes, and it is maybe hard to express this completely in how I understand it, is just I think one of the successes or things that's interesting about how neoliberals have moved their agenda is the multiple solutions that they, or multiple pragmatic or timely solutions they lift up. Like, so you'll have, you know, on climate, you know, cap and trade, and then you'll have completely like let it burn it all down, right? And those will be running in tandem or along with some other market thing, but they're all pointing like the market, the market, the market. So we'll have like 3 or 4, and one will be really way out there, and one will seem a little bit more reasonable. But at root, it's all sort of lifting to the same sort of framing. And I don't feel that the left has quite perfected that. We get bogged down in like, if I was to say right now, I think our position should be, you know, that we should just ban private schools altogether, like everybody into the same system. And that's the system. I can guarantee you amongst all of us, there would become this fight about, well, you can't say that. How are people going to feel? Rather than saying, fine, great, that's towards a public good, everybody the same, let's go. But I'm going to be talking about this particular aspect. So I do think there's a bit of trying to think about how are we making meaning, and really thinking about the underlying principles and values that we're trying to advance, and then allowing for some diversity of how we might offer solutions around that. Not saying it's the sole thing, because so clearly just talking about things never produces anything. I don't think it's sort of like, if we just had the best arguments, you know, we would end police brutality. I don't think that's the question, but I do think in terms of being able to organize masses of people to our point of view and in their own interests, we have to take seriously how are we framing and how are people approaching the problem, and even on beginning to understand it.
Thank you, Lauren. You brought us, you know, perfectly to where I want us to conclude before we answer a few audience questions. I'd like for you all to talk a little bit about, or to continue this discussion about what you want to see in terms of economic and social policies and the strategies that you think will get us there. Saqib, if you could start by explaining or talking through Acre's Cancel Wall Street campaign. I think it really speaks directly to the conversation we've been having here today.
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the things we're really launched. I just started thinking about how do we, you know, fight the coming austerity that's going to be hitting the cities and states across the country as we go into budget season. And so, you know, our framework for this is, what we need is to have, you know, we say that budgets are moral choices. We need to have moral budgets, right? And so that means we need more progressive revenue. We got to tax wealthy folks, tax the corporations, but it also means less regressive expenses, right? And the two regressive expenses that just take up a whole lot of money, one is policing. We have to defund the police. And secondly, it's Wall Street, right? We see in city, states, counties, school districts across the country pay $160 billion a year in interest on debt, right? Just in interest. And that's a lot of money, right? That's, you could basically pay for rent for 13 million families across the country for a full year. And help folks avoid foreclosure with $160 billion. But that's money that's going in interest payments to Wall Street. But what's the point of interest? Interest is supposed to be there primarily to mitigate against the risk of default, right? So that if you're basically, it's a little bit of profit to give to the borrower, to the lender, in case the borrower doesn't pay it back. Municipal borrowers, city, state, and local governments have a default rate of 0.16%. It's virtually non-existent. And moreover, states are actually not even allowed to file bankruptcy legally, so they have to pay it back. The risk of default is 0 with states. And more than half the states don't let cities default. So actually, like, there isn't actually much risk of default at all. In fact, we know the money is going to be there eventually. What's missing is we need some financial infrastructure to actually let cities and states borrow to basically just manage their cash flow. And as it turns out, we have a federal bank that could do that, right? The entire municipal bond market is $3.9 trillion. The Federal Reserve could easily make interest-free, long-term interest-free loans to all cities and states, and it wouldn't cost taxpayers a dime, but it would actually save state and local governments $160 billion a year in interest that they could put towards other things, right? To be clear, we need, in this moment of the pandemic, we need to have direct grants from the federal government to state and local governments. This is different than that because this isn't something we think we should do as pandemic response. This should just be a permanent policy going forward. There is no reason for the municipal bond market to exist. This $3.9 trillion market, which we pay $160 billion in interest every year, does not need to exist. The Fed could just do it. They have the money. It wouldn't actually cost us anything, and they would get the money back. That's the other thing. There's not any risk. They will get the money back. And so we launched this campaign last week, and we sort of kicked it off with, we did a press event with elected officials, community leaders, and union leaders from across the country. We have resolutions that were introduced to this effect in the city of Los Angeles, city of Chicago already, and resolutions in the works in the state of Illinois, the state of New York, and Cook County. We have elected officials from several, Baltimore, Philadelphia, LA, New York, Chicago, all signed on already in just the last week to a letter calling on the Fed chair to do this. And we're just getting started with this. So it's at councilwallstreet.org. Suggest let's check it out.
I second that. Definitely check it out. Thank you, Sakib. It makes sense to me. Would anybody else like to talk about what do you want to see and how are we going to get there?
I just want to say quickly, just to underscore the fantastic work Sakib was describing, is that, I think there used to be more of a tradition of kind of like popular economics work that many community and labor unions did. And you think about magazines like Dollars and Cents and others, to just try to give people some of the basic concepts that we really all need to decipher the economy. And I think to Lauren's point that there's no clear blueprint about this, but to go out and think about what resonates, what connects, is exactly what needs to happen. And then, also just lift, Lauren's point about it's the local impact. I just think of like the Chicago Teachers Union and their kind of like frame they used of both broke on purpose, but also really giving people a way to understand what does it mean when wealth is concentrated, who is the face of that, at what cost does it come, I think is much more powerful than what we all tend to do is just kind of like to abstract these things. So I live in a state which has, in Connecticut, the biggest inequality. There's something like 15 billionaires in the state, but it's difficult for people. Most of us are never going to see that world. We don't know where that comes from. It's hard to make that connection to why we're struggling to find internet connections for people in schools. So I think that is precisely the work of like putting it ahead, learning from it, sharing what's working to kind of advance these campaigns.
Thank you, Daniel. Any other last thoughts on this, Lauren?
I want to say that the partnership we are working, we have several of our affiliates that work on municipal budgets for many years, and others digging even deeper in the middle of this current crisis into this issue. And we've been supporting and working with folks on those campaigns. We are also really trying to think about how do we see this as a moment to make this pivot from just budgets as sort of a representative issue that we elect folks, we hope they carry our best interests forward, but also thinking about this as an opportunity to start to transform how citizens experience democracy and looking at more overall participatory budgeting campaigns that maybe are outside, not inside at first, and hoping to try to move them as inside and inside practices of electeds, but how are we inviting more people into the actual conversation of how commonly held resources are divided up and how priorities are decided in their city. And we definitely know that if we, in many cities where it is communities of color, working class communities, that in terms of empowering and bringing those voices forward, we'll hear very different takes from whether we should be cutting services to the most vulnerable communities in order to ensure that we increase policing or we increase services to wealthier parts of cities and towns. We know that we will hear a very different thing if we involve more people in this conversation, and hope to get at some of these questions on how do we create a mass movement that is rejecting austerity and the logic of austerity.
I'll add one thing to the challenging part that Daniel said I do. I don't think we can succeed without organizations that have huge numbers of members that see themselves as a part of those organizations in a deep way, like a union member sees as part of the union. I'm with the union. And I don't think we have anywhere near what we have to have. I don't think there's any organization that's big enough. I don't mean big email lists. That's clearly a part of it all. I mean actual organizations in cities, in states that are challenging and competing for power. I think that's probably our biggest challenge.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to, before we close, have you all answer some questions that have come in from our audience. David asks two questions, actually. His first question, we never seem to have austerity for police and the military, and asks you all to consider that thought. And also has a less serious question, what is the likelihood any of you will serve in a Biden cabinet?
Yeah, I'm likely to be the secretary of really good stuff.
I mean, I think that the first point about there's never austerity for police or military, that's exactly right. It sort of goes back to this point that austerity is manufactured. It's a lie, as Lauren said, right? Because it's really ultimately about priorities and what are their priorities, and they're not willing to cut for those things. They always find the money. And yeah, so that's why it's our job to actually put pressure on them and to actually organize so that we make it clear that actually cutting us is not acceptable. That if you find some other place to cut, it has to be elsewhere. And also, you don't have to cut, you also just get more money in. But yeah, so it just really is like, well, that's the job to task ahead of us is changing the calculus so that we're untouchable.
You know, just one thing to raise up about that really important question is the both the police budgets, which are certainly getting more attention, but also the military budget, right, which occupies just this enormous, obviously like portion of the federal expenditures in particular, but is really the organizing traditions we had that subjected it to critique, that kept it in the public, that asked questions about it, you know, really since 9/11 have been moved to the very margins of even left political action. So there's some work, for example, around maybe ROTC in schools and other things, but what used to be a really vibrant movement around intervention, we've kind of lost some of that. And I think some of it also has been, when Obama was elected, a kind of fear of criticizing him around that. So I think, really none of these revenue questions can be engaged if we don't take up that question. And that is also a knotty thing as the military economy penetrates into so many communities, into so many places, into so many people's livelihoods. The political work it's going to take to undo that, I think we can't underestimate. And I absolutely agree with Donald, like it's all centered on the base building we can do. In many places, not all late union members, even in public sector unions, are on board with these agendas. They're not on board with a reckoning with military spending. So even within the existing base, figuring out about how those conversations in meaningful ways, not just distributing talking points, but actually people can talk about them, talk about the impact militarization has had in their lives and other places, what could lie beyond that. And I'll just say, in many cases now, it's actually the right that takes more clear positions on interventionism, on kind of unrestrained militarism than many of our folks do, and certainly not part of our grassroots organization. This was a huge part of the legacy of Black freedom struggles that we've lost, and I think, need to find a way to insert it into this debate.
Well, and I would also add, we would need that and a BRAC process that, base realignment process where they went through a process of closing bases. We would need that to deal with the very real political issues of a whole bunch of people would lose their jobs, working class people around the country. So, it's that nexus of politics and policy, right? We don't need this military. 9/11 changed things. Remember the peace dividend? The wall came down, the peace dividend, there was all this opportunity, and then blah, blah, blah. But I think if we came up with a BRAC process, that can help us begin to say, we don't need all this stuff, and here's the stuff we do need, and let's figure out how to move it from here to there.
Thank you. I'm going to take us in a different direction with Armani's question, who asked, do you all think there's a potential to position the cooperative sector and worker ownership as an answer to austerity?
Yes, it's not something that I feel fluent in, but I do know that, for instance, the Malcolm X grassroots movement and Cooperation Jackson and Jackson, Mississippi, which I would say Jackson, Mississippi has been under austerity for even during the national boom times, have been doing some very careful thinking about how to build power outside that can contest inside of worker self-managed enterprises, based somewhat on some of the knowledge coming out of Mondragon, Spain, as well. So I do think it is worth exploring, but it may not be an answer. It may be part of it. I don't think it's an answer, and this is just the thing I want to, again, make my plea to my fellow movement people that we need to give up on magic bulletism and just abandon it. There is not going to be one strategy or one thing that is going to deliver the results or the shifts that we need. We need actually probably like 20, 30, 100 different things happening simultaneously, and sort of having more of a movement ecosystem that is able to think about riffing on each other rather than competing for who's right and who's got the right solution.
I'm going to agree and disagree a little bit with that. So I agree, but I think that you can't, I mean, all that's, I mean, I don't know much about it. Doing a little bit about Mondragon, and the circumstances which got created are very particular. They got their unemployment system, so which they had, you know, they got stuff, you know, because Franco didn't pay any attention to them. But I don't think we can do, you know, to really rebalance economic power in this country without massive increase in the number of people in collective bargaining. Even if that's different and, you know, looks differently with multi-employer stuff, with all the gig stuff, I don't think it's possible without that.
I agree. I think this is a piece of a puzzle, not a solution in and of itself. And so that's my point, is that I think that there have to be fights within private industry. I think there are things about, and I actually was much more sort of militant on this, like whatever, about solidarity economy stuff until doing a trip to Barcelona and sort of seeing how it works. Because if you think of it through the lens of like, it is an opportunity to develop people's capacities to govern capital and resources rather than a replacement for the fight that has to be had with extractive forces in capital, then it sort of fits into a more of a picture of like, it is one part of a strategy. It is not a substitute for unions and for labor organization.
Thank you, Lauren and Donald. I think this is a really grounding and centering conversation. I'm going to move us to a question from PRA's own Tarso Luis Ramos. We've seen neoliberal austerity work hand in hand with authoritarianism, as in Milton Friedman's advising of Chile's Pinochet. That was during the second global wave of authoritarianism, typically post-war military dictatorships propped up by the US or USSR. We're now in a third global great wave of authoritarianism. What role is neoliberal austerity playing in the rise of authoritarianism this time around? Big question. Who wants to take the first answer?
Ask this precise question one more time. This is, and you know, I saw the question. It's Tarso who's like challenges us to think the deepest. And say the last sentence again, the question sentence.
What role is neoliberal austerity playing in the rise of authoritarianism this time around?
Okay, well, let me say a few things which are going to be nowhere near as smart as the question asker, but he is no longer, he's not on this webinar. So I think it's really, so this may or may not be helpful. And first, I think we got to remember something. Corporations have one thing they do. They sell stuff. period. All they, so they sell stuff and they care about their volume, how many things they sell, how much money they make on each sale, how much they spend, you know, what their costs are and what their market share is. That's all they care about. Democracy's not necessary. They don't need democracy to do that. So I think there's plenty of examples where corporations in this country are paying for racists, right? I mean, we don't have a way to deal with corporations. It feels like more than kind of one at a time. Let's go after, you know, big ones, Amazon. Let's go after Walmart. Let's go after this. But they're funding this stuff. They're making this stuff possible. That's same, you know, I'm sure, I don't know enough about authoritarian regimes in other countries, but it's also true. If they have production, or either production or sales in any of those countries, it depends on their ability to have good relationships with the authoritarian regime and not care about the human rights violation. I just think that's the truth. Democracy is not in their interest.
I'll just a really quick thing and agree. I mean, Tarso's the one who should be answering that question, but you know, this is not just, it's, from my perspective, just an attack on a functioning democracy. Well, part of what we're seeing is the withering of the very notion that democracy provides. I mean, to Lauren's point about what does it mean to govern ourselves, our lives, our futures, that the existing configuration of institutions we have, not just outside the US, but within the US, has proven like you know, not just, you know, perhaps even fatally flawed. And I think that the fact that we're seeing just so much dissension and withdrawal of consent to the basic liberal institutions in this country and many other places, it's not just the shadowy figures out there, it's the deep flaws in the institutions here. And so I think, and this is the dilemma for us, which is on the one hand, we want to summon a call to defend individual rights, to defend the rule of law, to defend democratic institutions. But on the other hand, those same things are all part and parcel with what made so many people so vulnerable in this current crisis. And this is why I think the point about co-ops, about what is it that we need to do to reimagine, what would it mean for people to have income and jobs and food and healthcare without having to route all of that through the military so that people's needs can be taken care of? This is also the time for us to put that out. And there was a lot of talk about that at the beginning of the pandemic, like this is a new possibility for everything, to rethink everything. That actually seems like a long time away. And now we're focused on, you know, winning the election and short-term things. But the kind of clock is ticking on all of these possibilities. So I think the capacity to not just imagine, but to offer alternatives to these forms is really critical.
So like, I think if we just look back at what led us to where we're at right now, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, but like one of the clear things that brings us here is if we look at the fact that like the neoliberal policies that Obama and Biden enacted, the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, that really left the majority of people behind, right? And that's actually what led to the widespread disillusionment that Trump was then able to like racialize and exploit in order to come to power and to actually start build. I mean, and not before Trump, it was a Tea Party, right? But basically, a lot of the failures of the neoliberal policies of the Obama-Biden administration that actually like really did lay the groundwork for where we're at. And yes, they inherited a mess, but they inherited a mess and applied neoliberalism to it, which was not actually, which really sort of created the conditions that brought us here. So I think that that's at a domestic level, that's just a very clear thing. If we look globally, right, like, I mean, India, right, is sort of seeing like decades of like globalization, neoliberal policies that again have actually at the end of the day, like left people behind, which also has allowed for the rise of like a fascist like Modi to be elected not once, but twice in the second time with like a landslide victory, and is now very much sort of, you know, moving a fascist agenda with the support of neoliberal Democrats in the U.S. So that's, I think, like those are ways in which that these things sort of feed off each other.
Yeah, I think it was Daniel who made this point about that neoliberals don't need democracy. And I do think there's a sort of realignment we have to do in terms of how we understand our thinking, because we're so used to the US of talking about our politics between the two parties as like this one's left, this one's right, and not really having more of a complex view of how sort of there is a spectrum of views evinced and everything and put forward. It's like, yes, we have our stalwarts that are true believers in the tenets of liberal democracy, and so they will be sort of the institutionalists that'll keep to trying to defend at least the current stasis of rule of law, you know, the protection of courts, and sort of this ideals of you know, basically trying to reach a system of, you know, equality, so to speak, and having the market as one part of that. But then we also have folks that are very clear on that the rules of the game are they with the most power and money wins, and that democracy and liberal democracy is served as a hegemonic project to advance that, and then it sort of stops serving that as sort of more people are outside, right? We are in a moment where like traditional professions that used to be that you were in very comfortable middle class life are paid no more than, you know, what we're seeing with gig work right now, right? So we have college professors that are making as much as like Uber and Lyft drivers. That's real, right? Like that jobs that used to be sort of seen as like you're guaranteed to owning a home and living in sort of fancy neighborhood and being able to dine out weekly are now some of the lower paid professions. So that has sort of exacerbated some of this. And we know that we have portions of the neoliberal spectrum that are willing to move to maintain control, with a contradiction now. The capital is not able to deliver on sort of its stated goals of delivering the best chance at, you know, mass prosperity. It's now very clear that is not happening, right? You have some in the answer, and I think actually Senator Mike Lee tweeted this out within the last 24 hours. You know, we're not a democracy. We don't need democracy. That's not the project. So I do think it's sort of understanding that one, I think problematizing maybe our understanding of and being able to live with the complexity of not sort of saying all of them are the same, which I sometimes hear my fellow warriors in the Twitter streets crying aloud, and I'm like, maybe not. Doesn't make all of them friends, but it's important to understand distinctions. And I think there is a distinction on understanding that there is a wing in a portion of both, you know, perhaps both parties that are adherent to the principles of neoliberalism, that are willing to dispense with even the sort of theatrics of democracy. I can't answer this in the global context. It is true. Tarso should answer his own question on this, but you know, but I do think that our understanding, our bit of a getting that, you know, we've had one form of democracy, and there are certainly now actors in power that are willing to say goodbye to that and move to minority dictatorial rule.
Let me add a couple of things. The term neoliberal, describing people as the neoliberal, sometimes is a little fuzzy to me in terms of what, but to my point earlier, which I think is what one of the things you said, and we're not disagreeing, we're just furthering the conversation, is that corporations don't need democracy. They're the ones, I mean, because neoliberals, I'm not sure who they are. That's too big a swath as you describe. Corporations don't. And then what they also don't need, that they used to need, is American consumers that had money, right? Their interests have been just because you know, their emerging markets are their primary markets, or at least they have a diversity enough that used to need American consumers with money, Fordism and stuff like that. And so their interests now are not the same as ours. They don't need democracy, and their economic interests are not the same as ours. And just to add that point.
As well as we have billion-dollar corporations that their business model is a failure, such as the gig corporations, right? That are, through investment of venture capital and other sources, able to generate books that look, you know, have high valuation, but in fact, the business model itself is a failure.
And a fraud.
Thank you. I think you all did a wonderful job tackling Tarso's question, and we'll be sure to nudge him to answer it himself in the near future as well. I'm actually going to end us with another final question from Tarso. So producerism mobilizes anger at parasites below and above, yet mostly punches down. One exception is anti-Semitism, which positions Jews as elites, standing in for the finance sector, etc., and punches up. With growing austerity and global recession and anti-Semitism already mobilized by Trump and white nationalists, what can we anticipate, and how might we interrupt anti-Semitic producerism, even if that's even the best way to think of it? A big question once again, and I'm happy to read it again if need be.
Tarso's questions. I'll just jump in to say, I think that's exactly right. And this is where anti-Semitism, again, kind of forms the building blocks that makes these claims legible. So the whole notion that it's obviously like Soros, but also like Google, big tech, all of this are kind of exercising this outsized control. And the hard part is, of course, there is a criticism of concentrated wealth in all of these companies that we want to be able to sustain on the one hand. But as Tarso is saying, the part that makes it that people can kind of get their heads around it can't be separated from that history of that's rooted in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, and just as a quick example, I continue to work on the right-wing media, and there's an article on Breitbart the other day that said critical race theorists now control big tech algorithms concerning what we all watch. So it actually, and it seems on the one hand like a headline out of The Onion, but it actually is able to narrate like critical race theory, George Soros, Facebook, and Ibram Kendi, all in one kind of well-organized, syncopated collection. So I think, again, part of that is like part of the reason it resonates, not just on the right, but in other places, is that it does speak to, it's just even, groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer will take up some of it is like anti-capitalist language about the concentration of wealth and power, big pharma, et cetera. So this is just all the more reason for us to have, it's Saqib's and others, like the politics around ways that we can get our head around how the economy works, how wealth is concentrated. Because if we don't do that, this is what comes in its place.
That was great. Thank you, Daniel. Any other thoughts on this question before we close?
I mean, I'll say that I believe that actually PRA put together a really good guide on this. I would refer folks there, which is about how do you actually talk about Wall Street and sort of the concentration of power and wealth on Wall Street in ways that are not anti-Semitic, right? And part of it, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the key things in there is about like being factual, but being very deliberate about our language, that we're not actually using language that, just like slipping into a dog whistle language that is sort of has anti-Semitic like roots or overtones. But I would, I think once again, like Tarso's question is best answered by PRA, I think.
Thank you, Saqib. Well, thank you all. This was. I just want to say one thing to Tarso, since he's listening carefully, clearly, is from the panelists, and I think I speak for all of us, shorter, clearer, more simpler questions, please.
Well, I think we'll get to see Tarso's Q&A in action next week if you all tune in for PRA's webinar on misogyny and authoritarianism. I want to say thank you to all four of you, Lauren, Saqib, Daniel, Donald. This was a fabulous conversation. I think exceeded expectations. You all made austerity and political economy very interesting. Sometimes a hard feat to achieve. And I want to thank you all again for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.